Welcome to another episode of the Carolyn Glick Show. As I'm sure you know, the big story of the week is the massive earthquake that took place on Monday and continued on through the day, and continued earthquakes in Turkey and in Syria. We felt it here in Israel and parts of the country. And there are apparently right now, but the best estimate of the UN Tuesday morning is that 20,000 people have died. And what's notable, I mean, two things are notable about this. One is that the first country that offered help was Israel, and there's already an Israeli team from the IDF delegation there to help save people. They arrived overnight, and they started working this morning. And the second thing that's really interesting is that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu announced yesterday that calls for help to Israel also came from the Syrians, from Syria, an enemy state that's controlled by Iran, and yet they want Israeli help. Why do they want Israeli help? Well, let's ask Sudan. Last week, Foreign Minister Eli Cohen flew to Khartoum to meet with the president of Sudan. And essentially, the three no's of the famous Arab League conference from 1970, no to peace, no to normalization, no to recognition of Israel, no to end of war. I don't remember the three, but they were basically no way we're not talking to the Jews. They're all gone. Sudan wants to formally enter the Abraham Accords. They're officially a member of it, but they haven't opened their embassies here yet, like the other members of the Accords have, and they want to take a step towards that. And also last week, the president of Chad came to Israel and opened up Chad's embassy in Israel. And before that, the foreign minister of Greece came here. Why is it that all of these countries are making pilgrimages to Jerusalem and wanting to have closer ties with Israel and asking us for help in their hour of need, even the Syrians? Well, there are, I think, two reasons. The first reason is because Israel's in a position to help. We can help. Obviously, with earthquake relief, our home front command of the IDF since the 1991 Gulf War, when Israel was attacked with Scud missiles by Saddam Hussein, Israel has developed cutting-edge methods, technologies, modes of operation to save people from mass disasters, natural and war, that exists no place else on earth, not in the United States, not in Britain, not in Russia, not anywhere. We have more capabilities to save people from collapsed buildings than anybody else. So that's one reason. And so they're asking us for help in the case of the earthquake because we can help. But the other reason that all of these countries are coming to us is because we don't threaten them. We're not a superpower, nor do we want to be. We're not an empire, nor do we want to be. In fact, the Torah actually prohibits Jews from building an empire. It gives us the borders of the land of Israel, makes them very explicit, and says, beyond that, you're not allowed to go. This is your land. And so when you look at a country like Chad, you look at a country like Sudan, you look at a country like South Sudan, you look at all of these different countries, at Hungary, at Poland, even at France and at Germany, when they're trying to figure out and Ukraine, when they're trying to figure out how to protect themselves, they don't want to go to somebody that they're afraid is going to take their country away from them. They don't want help from China that's coming in and putting all these African states in a debt trap that they can't get out of. They don't want Iran that's going to try to transform all of them into Shiite jihadists or kill all their Jews or whatever it happens to be. They definitely don't want Russia. And they don't even really want, many of them, the United States, because they don't want to be pushed around. They don't want to be told what they have to do. They want to develop their country in their way. And they see that Israel has done an extraordinary job building 75 years after the establishment of our country. We are a regional power. We have one of the best economies and strongest economies in the world. We weathered the corona storm better than most countries. We came out of the recession from corona faster than most countries. And we're not as impacted as the rest of the Western world by the recession that's now coming to Europe and to the United States. One, because we're energy independent, and two, because we've managed our national debt better. So when you look at why they're coming to us, it's because after 75 years, Israel's incredibly successful. We've done it the Zionist revolution worked. And Israel is an extraordinarily successful, powerful state, capable not only of defending itself by itself, but capable of helping the nations of the world as well by itself. And that leads me to where we are right now in Israel, because in Israel, you have the elites of our country who are threatening civil war, who are threatening to murder Prime Minister Netanyahu and the ministers in his government, calling for people to take up arms, saying that if their demands are not met, that they're going to move from protests to actions. The last one was a statement made by the mayor of Tel Aviv last Saturday night. The explicit threat on the life of Prime Minister Netanyahu and the ministers in his cabinet, in his government, was made by former IDF pilot Zev Raz, who was the lead pilot in the raid on Osirak nuclear reactor in Iraq in 1981. One of the leading attorneys, the head of the biggest law firm in Israel, Chodek, called for taking up arms in an annual meeting of the Bar Association of Israel in Eilat last week. I mean, you were talking about leading members of Israeli society who are making these open calls for civil war. Benny Gantz was the one who talked about civil war. Ehud Barak over the weekend compared President Isaac Herzog of Israel to Neville Chamberlain and Prime Minister Netanyahu to Hitler when he put up a photoshopped image of President Herzog holding up a piece of paper over Neville Chamberlain's body when he was showing the Munich Agreement in 1938 with Hitler. And he said that because President Herzog is trying to get the left and the right to sit down and compromise on judicial reform, that he is Neville Chamberlain and that the right wing of Israel, the government, they're the Nazis, and Prime Minister Netanyahu is Herzog, and this is Hitler, and this is a former prime minister of Israel. Same thing, another former defense minister and chief of staff of the IDF, like Barak, Moshe Ya'alon, is calling the government fascist. They refuse to really condemn the likes of Zev Raz and Chodek and others who are explicitly calling for violence because they say, well, we don't want violence, but this is a fascist, illegitimate government, et cetera, et cetera. And when you look at the contrast between the Syrians asking Israel for help with earthquake relief and Erdogan coming to Israel and begging for us to send people, and we do immediately after the earthquake hits, and what's happening on the ground in Israel, the question is, how do we explain this yawning divide between how the world sees us and how we really are, and how the elites in Israel that are now in an open revolt, that Supreme Court President Esther Hayut refused to come to a ceremony at the Knesset, or she came to the ceremony, she refused to have her picture taken with the other heads of the arms of government, of the President of Israel, the Speaker of the Knesset, Prime Minister Netanyahu, and even her friend, opposition leader Yair Lapid. She didn't want to have her picture taken with him. She wouldn't deign to do that. She claimed that she had scheduling problems, but she had no problem sitting in the gallery in the Knesset for the Knesset's 74th birthday celebration official ceremony. So we see, and Aaron Barak, her predecessor, and she have completely castigated the government's plans for legal reforms. And to understand why, we have to understand that their cries are not about the reform, right? What does the reform do? What is the package that's on the table? What is it that's being discussed in the Knesset's Constitution and Legal and Law Committee today, and may go to a vote as early as Wednesday or Thursday in a preliminary reading? All they're talking about is the restoration of checks and balances on the judiciary in Israel. Over the past 30 years, the judiciary, as we've talked about repeatedly on this on this show, has arrogated it to itself unchecked powers to legislate from the bench, not only to cancel legislation, which was one of the early powers that it arrogated to itself, but actually to dictate what has to be in the laws. No other Supreme Court that I know of does that sort of thing, even the most activist. And they also intervene in real time in government policies and tell the army, no, tomorrow you can't destroy the home of a terrorist because we don't think it's right, or he was only using his bedroom, and you got to leave the rest of the house open so that they won't allow the army to carry out counterterrorism operations in real time. And they have taken this power. Nobody gave it to them. They seized this power without legal basis. And so in comes the government and says, look, we're not going to touch anything about your judicial independence to judge, but not to legislate and not to dictate policies. That's the purview of Israel's elected representatives. So what we're going to do is we're going to recognize that you have, as you did before you took away all of our power, you have the power to judge, just like every Supreme Court in the world. But we also have powers, among others, to appoint justices, among others, to limit your writ of judicial review. You cannot base your judicial review on things that aren't laws, because right now they say that if we think it's reasonable, we the justices think that something that the government did or or a law that the Knesset passed is unreasonable, we're going to cancel it. So you can't cancel it on the basis of how you feel. You have to cancel these laws if you want to cancel them. We're going to give you the right that you stole. We're going to now accept that you have the right that you stole to overturn laws. But you can't do it without basis in law. You have to actually make your judgments about the law. So these are the kinds of things these aren't the kinds of things, these are the things that are in the judicial reform plan. And when they're calling for a civil war, they're doing it for two reasons. I mean, we know why the former Supreme Court President Aaron Barak, who seized all these powers as the president, is against it, because they're taking away all the powers that he took for himself and for his colleagues. And we know why the Attorney General opposes it, because she's going to have limits placed on her power to dictate government policies as the Attorney General. And we know why Esther Chayut, the current Supreme Court judge, is doing that. So why are the Zev Razes of the world and the Ehud Baraks of the world, Benny Gantz, Yair Lapid, all of these leading politicians and political activists and elites, really the creme de la creme of Israel's financial sector, its legal sector, its military sector, 4 former chiefs of staff are in open rebellion and 1 deputy chief of staff. Why? I mean, do they really care about, they're so against the balance of powers in Israel? Well, kind of. But it's not just the balance of powers. I mean, they have these kinds of tantrums over everything that the right does, because the problem for them isn't so much the content of one thing or another. What Avigdor Lieberman, when he used to be on the right and they said that the country was going to go to hell in a handbasket because he was appointed defense minister, it's not that they oppose him per se. It's not that they oppose Netanyahu per se. It's not that they oppose the reforms per se. What they oppose is sharing power with the left, with the right. They think that through the Supreme Court and the legal fraternity for the past 40 years since they lost the working class in Israel and lost their automatic majority in Knesset elections, they've tried to maintain their power over the state through unelected bureaucracies. First and foremost, the Supreme Court, but the legal fraternity more generally, the IDF chief of general staff, and other very senior nodes of power in Israel that are under the elected leadership of Israel. And so they see this reform as a means to restore the power to lead to the people through their elected representatives. If you restore the power to legislate to the Knesset and the power to govern to the government, then the permanent bureaucracy in Israel is going to have its wings clipped. And that's something that they don't accept. And then there's a last thing also. When we look at the statements that they're making, the likes of Barak, the likes of Zev Raz, or I can't remember his first name, but Chodek, the leading, the senior attorney, and all of these very, very senior people in Israeli society that, have an open line to the prime minister, an open line to the chief of staff of the army, an open line to the senior journalists in Israel, et cetera, et cetera. They're their friends. They hang out together. And if they don't hang out directly together, they have common friends. What is it that they really feel motivated by? And I think that the answer is contempt and hatred. Because when we look at what they're saying, They don't even see the other side. Yair Lapid, the head of the opposition, gave a speech at the Knesset yesterday, at the Knesset's 74th birthday celebration, saying, if we don't get our way, we're leaving the country. We're taking our finances out. This is the first time that we feel that the country we love is no longer ours, and we're not going to accept. And he gave this, in a way, very endearing portrait of the distress that the people on the left are feeling now in the face of the government reforms. But there was one word that was missing from his entire speech, and it isn't by chance: compromise. He didn't say, we'll sit down and talk to you. Let's try to reach a meeting of the minds. He didn't say, reasonable people can differ, but let's see, okay, I'm going to come to the Constitution and Law Committee tomorrow, and I'm going to put out a different proposal, and let's see if we can come to terms. He didn't say, look, I have some ideas. Let's see if we can go over your draft, take some stuff from yours, take some stuff from mine, and come to a compromise. We all agree, I've spoken about it in the past, he has, about the need to clip the wings of the judiciary and place limits on its power. He talked about his father ran on it, Tomi Lapid, the former justice minister, the late Tomi Lapid, Yair Lapid's daddy. They ran on these things. These were their signature issues. And now suddenly, right, any reform of the judicial system is the end of democracy, is the end of the country. We're picking up stakes. We're leaving. We're taking our money with us. We're taking our jobs with us, etc. And we hate all of you. It's because they won't see the other side. Because actually sitting down and having a talk in the Knesset, recognizing that the people of Israel, the public that voted for this government, and that's voted for successive right-wing governments over the past 40 years, since the first time that the Likud came to power in 1977, so almost 40 years, almost 50 years ago, they don't accept that they have the right to lead. They don't accept that people like Justice Minister Yariv Levin, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, the head of the Constitution, Legal and Law Committee, Simcha Rotman, and others have a right to an opinion, have a right to power, have a right to power. And that's the reason why we are where we are. That's the reason why there is no discourse. That's the reason why people aren't embarrassed and want to vomit when they see the picture that Ehud Barak put up of Bougie Herzog, of Isaac Herzog, our president, as Neville Chamberlain, understanding that Netanyahu is Hitler in that picture. They don't think there's anything wrong with that, because they don't understand that there's something wrong with the way that they're looking at their fellow Israelis. They truly believe that they are the only people in this country that matter, that their votes are more important than the majority of Israelis, that they should lead this country because they have the right to lead, because they are the people who are enlightened and better than we are. And that's the problem. This is a psychological problem, more than a legal problem, more than a substantive problem, a policy dispute. It's not a policy dispute. It's a social dispute. Who gets to lead this country? Do the people actually have the right to determine the course of Israel, or are we supposed to be instructed by our betters? It's a fight between democracy and aristocracy. And when we talk about reaching a compromise, it's all well and good, but a compromise can only happen when both sides recognize the legitimacy of the other. And today, I think that if Lapid, Gantz, Esther Chayut, any of them would get down off of that tree and say, listen, okay, let's look over your draft. Let me see, what is the problem here for us? Maybe, we want a larger majority in the Knesset that can overturn Supreme Court decisions. Maybe we don't need that at all. Maybe we can look at this another way. Let's start. You have a bill here? Okay, let's work on it together. Let's see what we can do. If any one of them were to do that, so much of what's happening today in Israel would stop, and we would be able to act like grown-ups. But there's nobody acting like a responsible adult. And so we see. In Syria, they want our help, right? In Turkey, they want our help. Sudan, Greece, everywhere. Germany wants our help with drones. Everybody wants our help. Everybody looks to us and sees what a successful country we are. They see what an extraordinary people we are. They see that we don't want nothing from nobody except to be left on our own to do our thing. They see that we're not threatening them, and we were willing to help them. But here inside of Israel, we have an elite that refuses to recognize that they're part of a larger society and that their success is a function of the entirety of Israel. And that if they want to continue to go forward as a people in the country that they love too, they have to recognize that they're not here by themselves and that the rest of us here are not here just to serve them. Now we're going to move from this opening to an interview that I did with my friend David Wurmser, who you all know, a couple of days ago, where we're talking about these issues and how this fight, this social clash between the elite, between the woke in the United States' case, the elite in Europe, and the people, is playing out all over the world. One side is not looking at the other side. One side is not acknowledging the humanity and the rights of the other side. And until that happens, we're going to see success on the outside, and inside, we're in turmoil. Thanks. So we'll keep going. And we're back again this week with Dr. David Wurmser, my colleague from the Center for Security Policy, who's joining us remotely from Washington, D.C. So first of all, thanks, David, for coming back onto the show. It's always great to have you on.
Oh, it's wonderful being here.
Well, it's been a long time since we've spoken. In fact, I didn't even get a chance to see when the last time it was, but I think that since last we've spoken, the left in Israel has gone completely crazy. I've spoken about this a lot in recent weeks on the show, but I wanted to talk about it with you because for a couple of things. I wanted to talk about the left here in and of itself, and I also wanted to talk about it in the sort of larger spectrum of the left throughout the Western world, which increasingly, as I see it, seems to be turning its back on their own nation states and on nationhood of their own nations, and also on democracy. We hear more and more about elite rule and about enlightened people and about what's right and what's normative behavior, and that those are the sorts of things that are the purview of a very small select group of woke individuals in the United States and better thinking individuals here in Israel. They keep changing the names or the meanings of basic words and concepts like democracy to mean something completely different. So, first of all, you were here in Israel last week, and you were looking at what's happening here from an outsider's perspective. And I just wanted to get your impressions of the Israel that you saw as a visitor while you were here, one who knows this country well and is also very well aware of what's happening in the United States.
Well, obviously, one of the overwhelming factors in Israel last week when I was there was the debate over the reform, the legal reform that the new government, which was elected only 2 or 3 months ago, is proposing in Parliament. And the debate really has acquired a dimension I've never seen before in Israel. I've been going to Israel since, well, probably since most of your listeners have not, before they were born. Certainly since '77, I've been there a lot. And I've never seen a situation like this where it's not only the extreme left is now engaging in revolutionary and violent rhetoric. I mean, there's calls for the assassination of the prime minister. There's calls for civil war. There's calls for using guns against opponents, and so on and so forth. I mean, really crossing the line to outright incitement to kill. And that, of course, is way beyond anything we've seen, except for some teeny little fringes. Before, these calls were made by top lawyers in the country, a brigadier general in the Air Force, retired, but still was a brigadier general.
Retired colonel, and not only that, but he's a storied, Zev Raz. He was the lead F-16 in the 1981 attack against the Iraqi nuclear installation, Osirak nuclear reactor. And so yes, he's somebody who's well known. He's also been well known more recently as one of the leaders of the anti-Bibi riots that took place outside of the prime minister's official residence during Netanyahu's last term in office after he was indicted. So yeah, he's
Right.
both a war
So,
hero and also a hero of the woke revolution here.
but I suppose some people can take comfort in the fact that this is maybe a small minority. But the truth is, when you look at the overall debate on the left, their basic point is former Prime Minister Barak saying this government, this new Israeli government, has no legitimacy to rule. There's no basis for what he says. It was elected properly. Nobody disputes the elections. Nobody disputes the coalition formation. This is an outright cut and dry, clear election. And yet he says they don't rule legitimately. You have calls for civil unrest to shake the ground beneath the government, calls by major figures, including major high-tech figures saying, well, that's it, we're going to pull our money out of the country, trying to encourage foreign fears about the stability of Israel's economy and rule of law. You have the former Bank of Israel head say that the country is going to face economic damage from all this. So you're talking about really the institutionalized establishment left, not a fringe element. You could dismiss a few, but this is an overwhelming feeling that this government is driving Israel off a cliff, and that therefore they are saving the country and democracy from itself. Of course, that's an inversion of the government was properly elected. So to save democracy from itself, you have to ignore the results of the democratic election. And when you really dig into this, what really struck me was they're not engaging the right side of the spectrum. They're not addressing the points the right side of the spectrum is actually making, neither in terms of concerns or solutions to those concerns. There's no debate. There's just an outright rejection and conflict from the left, and no interest in a debate. And I think it was symbolized just yesterday by the fact that the president of Israel, President Herzog, called on convoking sort of the top leaders of both sides to start dialogue because this can tear the country apart. And sure enough, just because he dared propose dialogue, pictures of Neville Chamberlain or pictures of Herzog dressed as Neville Chamberlain, and of course we've already seen the pictures of Netanyahu as Hitler and so forth, suddenly appeared everywhere, as if now Herzog is on the target
Let me
hairs of the left.
just be more precise. The person who put them out was Ehud Barak, the former prime minister of Israel, the former chief of staff of the army, and the former chairman of the Labor Party, of which Yitzhak Herzog, the president, was also the chairman. He was the one who posted a picture of Bougie Herzog as Neville Chamberlain, coming back waving the Munich agreement in his hand of appeasement of Hitler, which means that Herzog, he was saying, was Chamberlain, and Netanyahu is Hitler. Right, and he apologized afterwards to Herzog, but he didn't apologize to Netanyahu. So it's even worse. It's a former prime minister, the former head of the Labor Party, saying that the current sitting president is Neville Chamberlain and the current sitting prime minister is Hitler.
Right. And it's really astonishing. So the rhetoric is crossed every red line imaginable. Every single red line imaginable, and it's calling for the removal of a democratically elected government. I mean, if you buy every single thing the left in America says about January 6th, multiply it by 10 or 1,000 or 100, and that's what you're getting in Israel right now, which is a group of people, the side of the spectrum that has no claim to having won the election or acquired the right to government, is trying to bring down the government and trying to use the legal structures, not legally use the structures, use legal structures to essentially launch what is a judicial coup. So I think that's the political climate. The reality, though, what's so shocking about this is when you dig into the weeds and you actually discuss calmly what is the legal situation in Israel, the judicial situation in Israel, which a lot of these people who are screaming have admitted for years is really a mess, and the proposals to fix it. What you see is that the magnitude of the problem and the moderation of the fix compared to the extreme shrillness of the debate, especially coming from the left, is out of whack, and that tells me something more deep is going on. That in fact, they have now the left believes that it had structures that allowed it to continue to rule even when it lost elections, and the right has finally figured that out after 75 years of the state. Disenfranchised populations feel that they may have a shot at finally structurally allowing for their enfranchisement. And this is so cutting to the bone of what is the problem, that those who benefit from the problem are truly now in an apocalyptic state of mind. So I think it's genuine what they're feeling, because they think they own the system. They feel that system is about to be compromised. And I think that shows the essence of the problem, which is a left that cannot win democratically anymore, so has institutionalized its power through non-democratic structures, legal structures, but not democratic structures. And the right, which is trying to go back to the foundations of Anglo-Saxon democracy and parliamentary democracy, and reestablish the sovereignty or the 1689 Bill of Rights in Britain, which established that the Parliament is the voice of the people, is the servant of the people, and that therefore the independence of the Parliament is representing the independence of the people. And if you compromise that, undermine it, or shut down Parliament, you are shutting down the voice of the people.
So, David, one of the things that really comes to my mind when I'm listening to you, aside from the contempt that they clearly have for just the average Israeli voter, and they show this in any number of ways, saying that you voted wrong, you wanted this judicial reform thing, and therefore we're going to tank the economy, or you voted wrong, and therefore, as Zev Raz said, all of our leaders should be killed. I mean, that's literally what he wrote on his Facebook page. He said that they have to start saying that Netanyahu and all of his ministers have to be killed if they dare to pass this legal reform package. So that's extraordinary contempt. But the other aspect of the left that's so notable is that, like you were saying, that these are all the first. These are the creme de la creme of Israeli society. These are the elites across a whole spectrum of economics and military, academia, law, all of journalism. Of course, the media here is 100% behind this, and in many ways leading this. So these are the top echelons of Israeli society across the professions, really, and they're also incredibly radicalized. I mean, they want to tank the national economy. They're going to Standard and Poor's and saying lower Israel's credit rating. There was this one reporter in Yediot Achronot, Itamar Eichner, who wrote really in a depressed way. Well, it's really depressing. Netanyahu spoke to these business leaders in Paris on Friday during his official visit to France, and none of them asked him about the legal reform, and he was really bummed out by it. And they have lost the connection to the mothership. They don't care what happens to this country, and they even say so. They say, if it's not our way, then we want to tank the country down with us. They have no fellow feeling for the people in the government. Like you said, they're not going to have any substantive conversations with anybody. They refuse to. They even said so. They said, if we discuss anything with them, then that means that we think that they're legitimate, and they're illegitimate, and therefore we're not going to have any conversations with them. So, I mean, A couple of questions arise from this. One is, where does this lead, do you think, Israel? And then, after we talk about that, how do we put this in line with the United States? We had Tony Blinken here last week, who was giving us, ultimatums on the Palestinians, which we can talk about afterwards. But do you see connections between the Biden administration and what's going on here, the American left, and what's going on here? I know that the American Jewish community, the leadership of the American Jewish community, is attaching itself to this rebellious elite and castigating the Israeli government. But where do you think, first of all, it's going to be leading to on the ground? These calls for murder and violence and refusal to give any legitimacy whatsoever to the will of the people in this country.
Well, unfortunately, I think that there's going to be an element that will not accept it, and no matter what happens, and they have to be watched and monitored very carefully. You could see for the first time in Israel's history a European-style sort of radicalized extreme left emerge with some terrorism and so forth. Except, they don't have to engage in terrorism because there already is terrorism coming from the Palestinian side. So all they have to do is just support them, and they don't, and so forth. But so I think you're going to have a fringe element. But I think in the middle, what will start happening, middle left, is they're going to realize that the Israel they're trying to preserve, which is the Israel that was created by the labor, hyper-secular, socialist, Ashkenazi elite in the country they owned, doesn't exist anymore in the shape and form and numbers that they believe should be. That's the Israel they want to somehow preserve. But that's not the reality of Israel. Israel has a much larger sector of traditional Jews who at least respect religion if they're not religious themselves, religious Jews, Sephardi Jews, immigrants who are not part of the Mayflower crowd, Ethiopians. Israel is not what it was in the 50s, and what it was in the 50s was not right. It imported or brought in a whole series of immigrants and then basically told them, we're going to shape you into images of ourselves, and if not, you're not part of the system. You don't own Zionism. You're not a stakeholder in this enterprise. So I think what you're seeing is on a larger section an anguish over the realization that they're losing the power to control the system in the last areas that they can continue to run the country. And those areas were very powerful. They were the courts, the education system, the military's top leadership, not the rank and file, by the way, the military's top leadership, some of the high-tech companies, because through their sort of advantages and so forth, they had dominated some of the education system. But even there, it's breaking down. Business elites are beginning to break down. So what you see is a whole crowd feeling the country is slipping away from their control. And I think a lot of them are anguished by it, but eventually will reconcile and figure a way to navigate through it, as well as generational change. Young Israelis are more to the right. I mean, it's one of the unique things about Israel is when you look at the military vote, which is defined, it's not a poll. We know what the military voted, and the military is defined in terms of its age in Israel, tends to vote to the right now. So you see the country is shifting, and I think that's just going to happen. And the majority of the left, after a lot of anguish, will eventually come to terms with it and begin to try to work its way through that. But I wouldn't rule out a very violent, extreme far left. And by extreme, I don't mean necessarily one or two people. If you look at some of the words coming out of major figures from the Meretz Party, for example, Yair Golan and so forth, these are justifications for some seriously dangerous, it's sort of the political cover for some dangerous tendencies. So we're talking about maybe not one person or 10 people, but potentially a measurable material percentage of the far left, which can become a real problem. And of course, they have the Arab population also that they can tap to batter the state. And you already see that happening. So I'm optimistic that the center in Israel will eventually reconcile, and some of the center is probably recoiling from this. And then lastly, once this really goes on for a while, what the actual reform is will start filtering into the public debate, and people will start thinking about it. And it's really not that unreasonable. So I think a good percentage of the middle will
It's
begin to
not
come to
unreasonable at
terms with the
all.
fact. Right. Yeah, exactly. Well, not well. They will begin to come to terms with the fact that, despite what they're hearing from the press, despite what they're hearing from their opposition leadership, despite what they're hearing from the Supreme Court and its acolytes, it's themselves, that actually these are quite reasonable things that empower people and shore up democracy. So I'm pretty confident that that the reform will win out in the end. Number one, and number two, it even has right now the Likud has 64 seats. If they wanted to, they could talk to nobody, change nothing, and simply ram it through with 64 seats. They have the power to do that. So really, the cards are not out there for the real opponents of reform. Also, the polls show 60 to 70% of Israelis know their legal system is messed up and out of control. So the bottom line assumption is there. And then excuse me, one final observation that really struck me when I was in Israel last week about this reform is you had 4 or 5 waves of seriously anguishing circumstances in Israel's history to the right. Oslo, which passed by the skin of the teeth in the parliament through some parliamentary tricks and gave up the heartland of the Jewish people to a terrorist organization. The breaking down of settlements that had been established by people and people living there who were the salt of the earth, part of our military. The removal of Gush Katif, the settlements, towns in Gaza, the violence, and the complete lack of recourse anybody on the right had to the legal structures was an anguish, losing their homes. We're not talking about some theoretical thing about democracy. People lost their homes and they had no recourse, and they were arrested and treated quite harshly. And yet, at the end of the day, the right, they never sang that famous song, Ein li eretz acheret, namely, I have no other country, but they acted it. They acted like this is their land. They have nowhere else to go. So they have to dig in, screw up their nerves, and find a way to get the majority of Israel behind them. And over 15, 20 years, they've done so. So now Israel is a different place than it was 20 years ago. The left, now that things are going not their way, their reaction is, well, we're going to take our money and go. Well, we're not going to pay taxes. Well, why don't we get the others to burn the house down? Why don't we get, JP Morgan or whatever to lower the credit ratings? So the commitment to the country and the feeling that you have no other choice but to make it work, the balance from an outside observer is toward the people who want reform and those who feel that finally they can be enfranchised once those reforms go through. So I think the balance of will, ultimately politically, drifts in that direction, despite the numbers in Parliament right now and the numbers
One
of
of
the
the things
polls.
that one of the things that I find notable is that they keep telling us that they, being the left, the unhinged left, in all its various permutations, whether in the media or the people on the people in the mob and in all of these demonstrations calling for violence and murder, or what have you, or the high-tech people who were assaulting motorists who were when they were blocking traffic in Tel Aviv last week, and all of their others, is that they keep saying that Israel is going to become Hungary or Poland, and they never talk about what actually happened either in Hungary or in Poland. And I mean, what happened in both of those countries is that the conservative traditionalist factions in those societies seized power democratically. What is seized power? They won power in elections, and they took the country in a direction that they wanted to go in, which was very different from the direction that the elites in Brussels want them to go. But they didn't do anything anti-democratic. They did everything in line with what the Polish people on the one hand and the Hungarian people on the other hand wanted. And what you really see here is a rejection of this globalized post-nationalist world that the post-nationalist transnational elites in places like Brussels and Davos and New York are advocating. And what's so amazing is that the people who hate the Hungarians and hate the Poles and hate Israel, um, they
And hate the Italians
they're
now
they're
and the
they're
British
sort of
government.
they're colluding now with the Israeli left, or the Israeli left is seeking their assistance. I mean, we see this very, very clearly with Haaretz newspaper, which is partially owned by a German publishing house. It was actually a Nazi publishing house, which is always a little bit of a poetic irony there. But so here they are. They're pushing so hard for international intervention against Israel. And I wrote a piece about it in Newsweek last week also, where I recalled that in 2007, Haaretz's editor David Landau asked U.S. Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice at the time at a dinner party in Tel Aviv for her to rape Israel, to force the government, which was then a left-wing government run by Ehud Olmert, to give the PLO more territory in Judea and Samaria. So this is a modus operandi of the left here, but it's also a modus operandi of the left everywhere, which is to demonize and castigate every leader, whether it's Donald Trump or Benjamin Netanyahu or Viktor Orban or whatever the Polish guy's name is, and say anybody who wants to have their borders protected, anybody who wants to preserve their national history and way of life is a fascist and is evil and is anti-democratic, even though all of these people won in democratic elections. And so there's so much similarity between what we're seeing here in Israel and what's playing out all over the Western world.
Yeah, what's playing out in the whole Western world is a global temper tantrum, and it's clear that it's the same sort of elite structures. The European Union's elites are not democratic. They now want to have a European Court of Justice, which operates again like the Israeli courts on some vague principles that they can appoint. They don't base their decisions anymore on law. They base their decisions in the European Court of Justice on some lofty principles that can be interpreted and imposed in any way to legislate, undermining the sovereignty of the various legislatures of the countries, let alone the countries. Which is why you have British leaving, why you have the Italians voting against this, why you have the Swedes, and why you have a lot of the Eastern Europeans pretty done with this, because they realize a lot of these Eastern Europeans, they didn't fight for their freedom from the Soviet Union only to submit to some other large transnational political structure of ideology. So you see, but I think there's a deeper issue, which is the left over the last 50 years, first of all, has become far more radicalized, but also far more institutionalized. They have managed to take over in Europe and in the United States and in Israel. Well, in Israel, it was baked into the way the nation was created by the Labor Party and so forth. But they have managed to take over main structures, whether it's the vast majority of print press, whether it's TV and TV press, or whether it's cultural institutions, the school systems, higher education, and so forth. In the United States, they failed, though, in a number of areas, the Supreme Court, and so forth. And in the press, well, there was just a new structure of information created through Fox News, Newsmax, and so forth, and then social media. They created social media, they more or less controlled it. And you see what happens. Elon Musk, who's a hero of the left, buys Twitter, removes the pro-left censorship that Twitter had internally, and all of a sudden, Elon Musk, frankly, they would rather put in a word for the devil than Elon Musk at this point. He's utterly demonized within a year, within a half year. So I think what you're seeing is the left has institutionalized its power over an immense amount of Western society. All the cards are basically in their hands, and they're being rejected. They're being rejected by the people, whether it's the phenomenon of Trump, whether it's the phenomenon of Meloni and Orban and Boris Johnson, whether it's the phenomenon of Netanyahu. They're being rejected by the people. People are not happy with this world vision.
Yeah, but I mean, when you talk about the, let me just say, when you talk about the institutionalization of the left's power, you're right, but it's also through the infiltration of intelligence agencies. I mean, what the Twitter files exposed was that the FBI had taken over Twitter. And I mean, you had 80 FBI agents working just in this, in the San Francisco office before the 2020 elections, going through the Twitter feeds of individual people and saying this is Russian disinformation, and they knew that there was no such thing. So I mean, you have something going on here that the institutionalization of the left is not only in media and in the legal fraternity and guilds. I mean, it's also in the intelligence agencies, and we're seeing this in Israel. I think it's pretty profound that you have all of these you have, I think, 4 or 5 former chiefs of staff of the IDF who are in on this, who are saying that the elected government of Israel is illegitimate. It's incredible.
Yeah,
here you have it, there you have it.
One can ascribe a lot to Trump's character and so forth, but I already saw it when I was in the White House under President Cheney in the Bush administration.
Vice President
Cheney under President Bush in the Bush administration. The intelligence community began to become a sabotaging arm. We didn't talk yet about some of the details of the reform and the use of the legal branches of the Israeli government, the legal advisors, or what would be in the United States, Attorney General's office or so forth, to essentially sabotage and paralyze policy. Well, you started seeing it in the United States with intelligence and foreign policy. Essentially, the intelligence communities would generate policy-based analyses. They didn't have objective analyses. They had policy-oriented analyses. And then they would turn around and they would say, this is the reality, and your policy, President Bush, doesn't square with what we're seeing in intelligence, which was, of course, stilted. And that therefore you're lying and people are dying and things like that. So essentially the intelligence community in the United States already in 2000 to 2005 made the point that the government is only an advisory body. Intelligence will tell you what proper policy will be. So you see how, whether it's the legal system in Israel, the intelligence structure in the United States, you see this institutionalized power beginning to assert itself through a narrow group of elites, assert itself over any democratic structure in the U.S. government. At the end of the day, the president represents the American people. His policy represents the will of the American people for 4 years. It isn't the intelligence community's choice to pick and choose what they like and actually do policy and pat the political echelon on the head and said, well, that was entertaining, but please now go away and let us really run policy. But that's the sentiment that you feel heavily, and you can only imagine when you get to the legal structures how utterly devastating that is, because that can shut down the entire government. And essentially in Israel, if you're a right-leaning government, it essentially has been shut down. So,
I
but the
mean,
left
for
now
4 years under Trump, we saw such incredible parallels in the way that the legal establishment in Israel was hounding and hunting down Benjamin Netanyahu. I mean, now we're learning more and more throughout his criminal trial, right? Of how they persecuted everybody who came close to him, all of his advisors, and they were strip searched and humiliated. They had their reputations destroyed for nothing. They were essentially tortured while they were under arrest on no charges. They were denied sleep. They were denied food. They were put into these flea infested cells. And they had their attorney client privileges were completely disregarded, and they were using family members against one another, arresting people's wives, arresting people's children to try to put pressure on them to cop a plea or to give to give in Netanyahu and just say anything against him to try to incriminate him. I mean, these things are shocking, and they're shocking the conscience of Israelis, and that really is the thing that pushed so many Israelis over the edge, realizing that this just cannot go on and we need legal reform. And it turned legal reform into the most important voting issue in the November 1st elections in the United States. By the same token, you had a completely concocted tale of Russian intervention, not in one U.S. presidential election in 2016, but also in 2020, right, when they pretended that Hunter Biden's laptop was concocted by Russian intelligence agencies, which was a total lie. It was his all along. It was all true, and you had 50 intelligence professionals, so called, signing a letter saying that it was a Russian disinformation campaign. But you had Trump and everybody around him, even his very distant advisors Carter Page, is like a volunteer in his campaign. They're hounded. Their lives are turned upside down. They have to spend millions of dollars, which they probably don't even have on legal bills, to defend themselves against an FBI that just wants to get Trump. And I mean, the parallels between the two situations were stunning to anybody who was paying attention to what was happening in Israel and in the United States. And things have only gotten worse. So in Israel, we have taken a step forward to cleaning out the deep state, and the deep state is on a rampage. And in the United States, they just shut it all down. They went into Mar-a-Lago, took whatever stuff Trump had there, said that he had stolen nuclear secrets and God knows what else, and you just don't know what you know
yeah, it
all of the
turned out to
people who
be
are in
very few
positions of
documents,
authority
not
seem
that
to be
important.
lying, you know.
Absolutely. Look, in the end, what happened in Mar-a-Lago, by the way, amounted to pretty much nothing. I mean, there were a few documents that weren't very important, certainly not nuclear codes or anything. So, yeah, I mean, I think what you're seeing here is ultimately um, the arrogance. You see, they've created such a bubble around their power that they're no longer listening. I mean, you see it in this public debate in Israel. And by the way, this whole thing shows why Israel matters in the United States. To the administration, it matters because if Israel goes wrong and begins to break the grip of this fraternity, this aristocratic class that runs Israel, it has reverberations in the United States because it is a similar situation, and in fact, it is really part of a larger situation. So what happens in Israel matters for Macron and the EU elites. What happens in Israel matters for the left here, but it also matters for the other side, for our side, for the Republicans, for the Malonis and Boris Johnsons and so forth, because at the end of the day, breaking that, beginning to expose what's really going on here, and the political failure essentially of the left. What's happened is they've enclosed themselves in a bubble through social media, through the press. They've been talking to themselves now so much for 10, 20 years that they've acquired this sort of lofty arrogance to their views against common people. And you started seeing it with the election of Trump in 2016. You started seeing the shift of blue collar workers in the United States of all ethnicities toward the Republicans because they felt that they were roadkill to the left's ideology, this great ideology that the elites had. Um, you started seeing it in Europe, this growing tendency among European countries to entertain more and more to the right, uh, because essentially the EU elite is no longer legitimate in a democratic way inside the countries. And then finally in Israel, you see it in the rise of this left who cannot win elections. Let's face it, they ran the last government, but it was really only for it was a year and a half. Number one, and number two, only because they could convince a right-wing party to form a left-wing government. So it was no verdict toward the left. So what you're seeing is a fundamental popular rejection of this aristocracy. This, philosophically, one could call it the embodiment of the philosopher king ideology. A group of highly intellectual, great philosophers are the best to run the country, not the people or anything else. So it is really the philosopher king ideology of Plato, which has led to communism and the French Revolution and so forth. Anyway, bottom line is you see the democratic rejection of this idea and the institutionalized power. And that's a clash that is now happening. And they've used Orwellian speak to essentially turn upside down the meaning of every word. So when you have a democratic reaction to an aristocratic retrenchment of power, they call that anti-democratic. When you talk about telling the courts that they have to actually make judgments based on law, not make law to make judgments, that is called rule of law rather than law, arbitrary
Rule of
rule.
the lawyers.
So you see exactly. So what you see is also the inversion of language here. But of course, the United States' left is going to be on the side of the Israeli left because it's the same threat to their aristocratic control. And I think that's really the subtext of what's going on in Israel. And the fact that the left feels it's losing ground, it feels the threat, and it's being rejected on a popular level, that then drives the tantrum and hysteria that we're beginning to see everywhere, not just in Israel, but in the United States. So Israel is basically the harbinger, the first act in what you will see here in the United States eventually too.
Well, I mean, in a way, the thing that most distresses me is that here in Israel and there in the United States and in European countries as well, you see societies that are just breaking apart or breaking up. You have you worry all the time, where is the center, and the center seems to be shrinking. But I'll just give you an example. I mean, this week or late last week, Congress under Kevin McCarthy threw Ilhan Omar out of the House Foreign Relations Committee. And just to give you a sense, you people were viewing. I mean, you know who she is, but I don't know how well reported it was that the Iranian Foreign Ministry condemned the move because she was a shill for the Iranian regime against the Iranian freedom fighters on the streets demanding, calling for a revolution and the overthrow of the regime. So she was on the side of the Ayatollahs, just like she was on the side of Al Qaeda, who she laughed off as nothing, and Hezbollah, who she laughed off as nothing, and she's an anti Semite. The thing that was astounding to me, or two things. One is that every single Democrat voted against throwing her off the committee, including 22 Jewish Democrats in Congress. All of them thought that it was a great idea to keep this woman, who is a stooge of Iran, who is an out and out Jew hater and pro Al Qaeda and anti American, on the House Foreign Relations Committee. That is a testament, I think, to if you need to know an answer, who is in charge of the Democratic Party? Well, we know Ilhan Omar is in charge of the Democratic Party because whoever is in charge is the person you're not allowed to criticize. And nobody can criticize this out and out Jew hater, just like they don't criticize Farrakhan anymore and everything is fine, and all of the anti-Semites are on the right, and anybody who says differently is an anti-Semite himself, because there can't possibly be any anti-Semitism on the left, because to be a Jew means to be a leftist, and therefore, if you're anti-leftist, you are by definition anti-Jewish, and that's the kind of thinking they have, and it's the same thing here. They're not being anti-Israel when they're boycotting Israel, when they're calling for an economic boycott of their country, when they're calling for Standard and Poor's to lower Israel's credit rating for nothing except that they don't like the way that the public voted. I mean, you see here, and they call Bibi Hitler, which is a form of Holocaust denial. You just you're seeing a society falling apart. You're seeing one side rejecting their nation's right to self-defense, whether it's Israel or the United States, and you're seeing the other side saying, no, we do have a right to self-defense, and we're going to maintain it, and we're going to fight our enemies. So I mean, this is an alarming phenomenon. I mean, it's not new. We saw it already after 9/11, when the left in the United States said, what did we do to make them think that they had to attack us? What did we do to them? Instead of just accepting that America has enemies because that's just how it is. Or in Israel, when after September of 2000, the left wanted to blame Ehud Barak for what happened when the Palestinians rejected peace and statehood, and went to war and declared jihad against Israel. So, you have this radicalization of the left. It starts on the fringes, and then it moves to the center, and then there is no center anymore, and all you have are two very divided societies, one that holds all the nodes of power and one that wins power in elections.
And that's an intentional strategy. It's a forced division. Uh, it's you almost have to look now at the global left in religious or theological terms. They're not religious because they don't believe in God and so forth, these elites. But they have replaced it. It's an ersatz religion. They've replaced it with a certain body of ideas. And like a religion, they're beginning to, especially an ideological, religious ideology, they're beginning to acquire all the characteristics. The first one is a certain degree of anarchism and nihilism. Then you have after that a certain, the old pendulum theory that if you destabilize things enough, the pendulum swings back and forth and you grab. So there's a deliberate sort of forced division and forced choice that is behind these ideologies. You can't just be a fencer. You have to be mobilized to their ideology. So somebody who says, listen, just leave me out of it, that's not acceptable. You have to actively take part. You see it physically when you had the summer of 2020 riots. If you remember all those various restaurants and so forth in Washington, people would come around and they'd force the guests in the restaurant not to say, oh, it's okay, I'm not right wing or anything like that. They forced them to spout the slogan of Black Lives Matter. Why? Because they cannot accept a middle ground, a third way, a middle. They have to mobilize that middle toward them. So they're forcing, like every religious ideology does, forces a division. Then you have the second thing, which is these religious ideologies, they have a vanguard elite, and that's the philosopher king. People who have a better knowledge, who are seen to be somewhat superior in their awareness of the ideology and understanding of the ideology, that then becomes sort of an uber class that rules over the more uninformed masses that don't properly yet have the conscience. So that's where the elites come in. And it's a whole structure. And if you look in the West now, that is essentially what's emerging. And that is not a structure that can be ultimately moderated. It has to be defeated. And that's why the battle for the middle is very important. But the battle also to discredit the ideas and the ideology behind this civil secular religion that has emerged are also very important. I'm not saying secularism has to be defeated, but this secular religion, this that you see it in the halls of Davos and so forth. This has to be defeated as an idea, like other ideologies have to be defeated. And only then
Well,
are you
I
going to
think that
see the pressure to divide the country to stop. Yeah.
no, I agree. I think we're seeing that a bit, and I think that the left here in Israel is making a lot of mistakes. I think it was a mistake to go after the president of Israel for trying to find common ground. I think that it's a mistake for them to call for murder. I think that, you know, a lot of these things are mistakes, and I think that losing uh they are losing the sort of the few centrists that are still around in Israel who are getting a little bit frightened by them. And I'll say one other thing, which is that you have all the people who are the heads of the venture capital firms in Israel, and they are very far to the left. It's people like Errol Margalit, who started off in Meretz and then moved to the Labor Party, which is the same thing, very, very far to the left. So the owners of the venture capital firms are left, but all of the engineers are on the right. So right now, all of the not all of them, but you know, about over half of them are, and they're quiet because they need the VC people in order to invest in their companies. But at the end of the day, if it's not going to be Israeli VCs who are investing in their company, it'll be somebody else. It'll be the government, or it'll be outside forces because their ideas are good enough. Then they're going to attract capital, and they're going to have to stand up for themselves. They're afraid to because they don't want to lose their funding, but you know, I think people are getting tired of being bullied as well. You know, they see the footage, they see the calls, they see all the PLO flags and these anti-government rallies in Jerusalem, and I mean in Tel Aviv and in Ra'anana and in other places, and they're freaked out. I mean, the day after the massacre of the seven Jews outside of their synagogue in Jerusalem, you had demonstrators in Tel Aviv holding up PLO flags, and that really was stunning to a lot of people. So I think, you know,
Absolutely.
I hopefully over time things will cool down as they make more and more mistakes. They become more and more uh, nuclear, you know, radioactive. The head of the, until last week, the head of the demonstrations was the head of the Bar Association, and he literally got caught with his pants down, you know, in this very embarrassing video that was exposed of him trading sexual favors for a judgeship for a woman who may have been his paramour and may have just been somebody who was he was abusing. But whatever the case may be, he was disgraced. The Bar Association was disgraced. The idea that they should be involved in the selection of judges was just, you know, was just destroyed. So I mean, things are happening, and hopefully, you know, and you see in the United States, Hunter Biden acknowledged that this was his laptop, and a lot of people are waking up to the fact that the Russia collusion thing was a complete lie. So we'll have to keep watching this space. I think we're going to have to cut off the discussion for today, but I think that you know, we've covered a lot of ground. We have some real conceptual problems with our left in the international community, generally in the West and in Israel specifically, and there's a lot to learn about it and a lot to overcome. So. Yeah, I
Absolutely.
thank you for joining me in this journey, and we will see you
And
guys
here.
again next week and talk about it from another perspective. So, in the meantime, we'll see you later and have a great day.